The Well of Loneliness by Radclyffe. Chapter 3. Stephen never went to her father's study in order to talk of her grief over Collins. A reticence strange in so young a child, together with a new, stubborn pride, held her tongue tight so that she fought out her battle alone, and Sir Philip allowed her to do so. Collins disappeared with her footman, and in Collins' stead came a new second housemaid, a niece of Miss Bingham, who was even more timid than her predecessor, and who talked not at all. She was ugly, having small round black eyes like currants, not inquisitive blue eyes like Collins. With set lips and tight throat, Stephen watched this intruder as she scuttled to and fro doing Collins' duties. She would sit and scowl at the poor Winifred darkly, devising small torments to add to her labours, such as stepping on the dustpan and upsetting its contents, or hiding away the brooms and brushes and slop cloths, until Winifred, distracted, would finally unearth them from the most inappropriate places. "Oh, did slop cloths get in air?" she would mutter, discovering them under a nursery cushion, and her face would grow blotchy with anxiety and fear as she glanced towards Miss Bingham. But at night, when the child lay lonely and wakeful, these acts that had proved a consolation in the morning, having sprung from a desperate kind of loyalty to Collins, these acts would seem trivial and silly and useless, since Collins could neither know of them nor see them, and the tears that had been held in check through the day would well upon Stephen's eyelids. Nor could she, in those lonely watches of the night time, pluck up courage enough to reproach the Lord Jesus, who she felt could have helped her quite well had he chosen to accord her a housemaiden's knee. Stephen would think, "He loves neither me nor Collins. He wants all the pain for himself. He won't share it." And then she would feel contrite. "Oh, I'm sorry, Lord Jesus, 'cause I do know you love all miserable sinners." And the thought that perhaps she had been unjust to Jesus would reduce her to still further tears. Very dreadful indeed were those nights spent in weeping, spent in doubting the Lord and his servant Collins. The hours would drag by in intolerable blackness that in passing seemed to envelop Stephen's body, making her feel now hot and now cold. The grandfather clock on the stairs ticked so loudly that her head ached to hear its unnatural ticking. When it chimed, which it did at the hours and half-hours, its voice seemed to shake the whole house with terror, until Stephen would creep down under the bedclothes to hide from she knew not what. But presently, humbled beneath the blankets, the child would be soothed by a warm sense of safety, and her nerves would relax, while her body grew limp with the drowsiness of bed. Then suddenly a big and confounding yawn, and another, until darkness and Collins and the tall clocks that menace, and Stephen herself were all blended and merged into something quite friendly, a harmonious whole, neither fearful nor doubting, the blessed illness we call sleep. In the weeks that followed on Colin's departure, Anna tried to be very gentle with her daughter, having the child more frequently with her, more diligently fondling Stephen. Mother and daughter would walk in the garden, or wander about together through the meadows, and Anna would remember the son of her dreams, who had played with her in those meadows. A great sadness would cloud her eyes for a moment, an infinite regret as she looked down at Stephen, and Stephen, quick to discern that sadness, would press Anna's hands with small, anxious fingers. She would long to inquire what troubled her mother, but would be held speechless through shyness. The scent of the meadows would move those two strongly. The queer, pungent smell from the hearts of dog daisies, the buttercup smell, faintly green like the grass, and then meadow sweat that grew close by the hedge. Sometimes Stephen must tug on her mother's sleeve sharply, intolerable to bear that thick fragrance alone. One day she had said, "Stand still, or you'll hurt it. It's all around us. It's a white smell. It reminds me of you." And then she had flushed, and had glanced up quickly, rather frightened in case she should find Anna laughing. But her mother had looked at her curiously, gravely, puzzled by this creature who seemed all contradictions, at one moment so hard, at another so gentle, gentle to tenderness even. Anna had been stirred, as her child had been stirred, by the breath of the meadow sweet under the hedge, for in this they were one, the mother and the daughter, having each in her veins the warm Celtic blood that takes note of such things. Could they only have divined it, such simple things might have formed a link between them. A great will to love had suddenly possessed Anna Gordon, there in that sunlit meadow. A great will to love had suddenly possessed Anna Gordon, there in that sunlit meadow, had possessed them both as they stood together, bridging, had possessed them both as they stood together, bridging the gulf between had possessed them both, had possessed them both as they had stood, had possessed them both as they stood there, bridging the gulf between maturity and childhood. They had gazed at each other as through, they had gazed at each other as though asking for something, as though seeking for something, the one from the other. Then the moment had passed, they had walked on in silence, no nearer in spirit than before. No nearer in spirit as they were before. No nearer in spirit as they had been before. No nearer in spirit than they, no nearer in spirit than before. Sometimes Anna would drive Stephen into Great Malvern, to the shops with lunch at the Abbey Hotel, on cold beer and wholesome rice pudding. Stephen loathed these excursions, which meant dressing up, but she bore them because of the honour which she felt to be hers when escorting her mother through the streets, especially Church Street, with its long busy hill, because everyone saw you in Church Street. Hats would be lifted with obvious respect, while a humble finger might fly to a forelock. Women would bow, and a few even curtsied to the lady of Morton. Women in from the country, with speckled sunbonnets that looked like their hens, and kind face like brown, wrinkled apples. Then Hannah must stop to inquire about calves and babies and foals. Indeed, all such creatures prosper on farms, and her voice would be gentle because she loved such young creatures. Stephen would stand just a little behind her, thinking how gracious and lovely she was, comparing her slim and elegant shoulders with the toil-thickened back of old Miss Bennet, with the ugly bent spine of young Miss Thompson, who coughed when she spoke and then said, "I beg your pardon," as though she were conscious that one did not cough in front of a goddess like Anna. Presently Anna would look round for Stephen. "Oh, there you are, darling. We must go into Jackson's and change mother's books. Or Nanny wants some more sauces. Let's walk on and get them at Langley's." Stephen would suddenly spring to attention, especially if they were crossing the street. She would look right and left for imaginary traffic, slipping a hand under Anna's elbow. "Come with me," she would order, "and take care of Puddles, 'cause you might get your feet wet. Hold on by me, mother." Anna would feel the small hand at her elbow, and would think that the fingers were curiously strong and affectionate. They would feel like Sir Philip's, and this always vaguely displeased her. Nevertheless, she would smile at Stephen while she let the child guide her in and out between the puddles. She would say, "Thank you, dear, you're as strong as a lion," trying to keep the displeasure from her voice. Very protective and careful was Stephen when she and her mother were out alone together. Not all her queer shyness could prevent her from protecting, nor could Anna's own shyness save her from protection. She was forced to submit to a quiet supervision that was painstaking, gentle, but extremely persistent. And yet, was this love? Anna often wondered. It was not, she felt sure, the trusting devotion that Stephen had always felt for her father. It was more like a sort of instinctive admiration, coupled with a large, patient kindness. If she only talked to me as she talked to Philip, I might get to understand her, Anna would muse. It's so odd not to know what she's feeling or thinking, to suspect something's always being kept in the background. Their drives home from Malvern were usually quite silent, for Stephen would feel that her task was accomplished, her mother no longer needing her protection now that the coachman had the care of them both, he and the arrogant-looking grey cobs that were yet so mannerly and gentle. As for Anna, she would sigh and lean back in her corner, weary of trying to make conversation. She would wonder if Stephen would try or just sulk, or if, after all, the child might be stupid. Ought she perhaps to feel sorry for the child? She could never quite make up her mind. Meanwhile, Stephen, enjoying the comfortable brougham, would begin to indulge in kaleidoscopic musings, those musings that belong to the end of the day and occasionally visit children. Miss Thompson's bent spine, it looked like a bow, not a ribbon bow, but one of those archery kind. If you stretched a tight string from her feet to her head, could you shoot straight with Mrs. Thompson? China dogs. They had nice China dogs at Langley's. They made you think of someone. Yes, of course, Collins. Collins in a cottage with red China dogs. But you try not to think of Collins. There was such a queer light slanting over the hills, a kind of gold glory, and it made you feel sorry. Why should golden glory make you feel sorry when it shone that way on the hills? Rice puddings, almost as bad as tapioca. Not quite, though, because it was not so slimy. Tapioca evaded your efforts to chew it. It felt horrid, like biting down on your own gum. The lane smelt of wetness, a wonderful smell. Yet when Nanny washed things, they only smelt of soap. But then, of course, God washed the world without soap. Being God, perhaps he didn't need any. You need a lot, especially for hands. Did God wash his hands without soap? Mother, talking about calves and babies and looking like the Virgin Mary in the church, the only one in the stained-glass windows with Jesus, which reminded you of Church Street. Not a bad place after all. Church Street was really rather exciting. What fun it must be for men to have hats that they could take off instead of just smiling. A bowler must be much more fun than a leghorn. You couldn't take that off to Mother. The brougham would roll smoothly along the white road, between stout leafy hedges starred with dog roses. Blackbirds and thrushes would be singing loudly, so loudly that Stephen could hear their voices above the quick clip-clip of the cobs and the muffled sound of the carriage. Then, from under her brows, she must glance across at Anna, who she knew loved the songs of blackbirds and thrushes, but Anna's face would be hidden in the shadow while her hands lay placidly folded. And now the horses, nearing their stables, would rebound their efforts as they swung through the gates, the tall iron gates of the parklands of Morton, faithful gates that had always meant home. Old trees would fly past, then the paddocks with their cattle, Worcestershire cattle, their uncanny white faces, then the two quiet lakes where the swans reared their cygnets, then the lawns, and at last the wide curve in the drive near the house that would lead to the massive entrance. The child was too young to know why the beauty of Morton would bring a lump to her throat when she sees thus in the golden haze of the late afternoon, with thoughts of the evening upon it. She would want to cry out in a kind of protest that was very near tears, "Stop it, you're hurting!" But instead she would blink hard and shut her lips tightly, unhappy yet happy. It was a queer feeling. It was too big for Stephen, who was still rather little when it came to affairs of the spirit. The spirit of Morton would be part of her then, but always would remain somewhere deep down within her, aloof and untouched by the years that must follow, by the stress and the ugliness of life. In those after years certain scents would evoke it, the scent of damp brush growing by water, the kind, slightly milky odor of cattle, the smell of dried rose leaves and orris root, and violets, that, together with the vague suggestion of beeswax, always hung around Anna's room. Then that part of Stephen that she still shared with Morton would know what it was to feel terribly lonely, like a soul that wakes up to find itself wandering unwanted between the spheres. Anna and Stephen would take off their coat and go to the study in search of Sir Philip, who would usually be there waiting. "Hello, Stephen," he would say in his pleasant, deep voice, but his eyes would be resting on Anna. Stephen's eyes infallibly followed her father's, so that she too would stand looking at Anna, and sometimes she must catch her breath in surprise at the fullness of that calm beauty. She'd never got used to her mother's beauty. It always surprised her each time she saw it. It was one of those queerly unbearable things, like the fragrance of a meadow sweet under the hedges. Anna might say, "What's the matter, Stephen? For goodness sake, darling, do stop staring." And Stephen would feel hot with shame and confusion because Anna had caught her staring. Sir Philip usually came to her rescue. "Stephen, here's that new picture book about hunting." Or, "I know a really nice painting of young Nelson. If you're good, I'll order it for you tomorrow." But after a little, he and Anna must get talking, amusing themselves irrespective of Stephen, inventing amusing little games, like two children, which games did not always include the real child. Stephen would sit there silently watching, but her heart would be a prayer to the strange emotions that 7 years old could not cope with, and for which it could find no adequate names. All she would know was that seeing her parents together in this mood would fill her with longings for something that she wanted yet could not define, a something that would make her as happy as they were. And this something would always be mixed up with Morton, with grave, stately rooms like her father's study, with wide views from windows that let in much sunshine and the sense of the spacious garden. Her mind would go groping around for a reason, and would find no reason, unless it were Collins. But Collins would refuse to fit into these pictures. Even love must admit that she did not belong there any more than the brushes and buckets and slop-cloths belonged in the dignified study. Presently Stephen must go off to her tea, leaving the two grown-up children together, secretly divining that neither of them would miss her, not even her father. Arriving in the nursery, she would probably be cross, because her heart felt very empty and tearful, or because, having looked at herself in the glass, she had decided that she loathed her auburn long hair. Snatching at a slice of thick bread and butter, she would upset the milk jug, or break a new teacup, or smear the front of her dress with her fingers, to the fury of Miss Bingham. If she spoke at such times, it was usually to threaten, "I'm going to cut all my hair off. You see if I don't." Or, "I hate this white dress. I'm going to bum it. It makes me feel idiotic." But once launched, she would dig up the grievances of months, going back to the time of the would-be young Nelson, loudly complaining that being a girl spoiled everything, even Nelson. The rest of the evening would be spent in grumbling, because one does grumble when one is unhappy. At least one does grumble when one is 7. Later on it may seem rather useless. At last the hour of the bath would arrive, and still grumbling, Stephen must submit to Miss Bingham, fidgeting under the nurse's rough fingers, like a dog in the hands of a trimmer. There she would stand, pretending to shiver, a strong little figure, narrow-hipped and wide-shouldered. Her floss was weary and thin as a greyhound's, and even more ceaselessly restless. "God doesn't use soap," she might suddenly remark, at which Miss Bingham must smile, none too kindly. "Maybe not, Miss Stephen. He don't have to wash you. If he did, he'd need plenty of soap, I'd be bound." The bath over, and Stephen guarded in the nightgown, a long pause would ensue, known as "waiting for Mother." And if Mother, for some reason, did not happen to arrive, the pause could be spun out for quite 20 minutes, or for half an hour even, if luck was with Stephen, and the nurse's clock not too precise and old-maidish. "Now come on, say your prayers," Miss Bingham would order, "and you better ask the Lord to forgive you. Impertinence, I call it. And you, a young lady, carrying on because you can't be a boy." Stephen would kneel by the side of the bed, but in such moods as these her prayers would sound angry. The nurse would protest, "Not so loud, Miss Stephen. Pray slower, and don't shout at the Lord. He won't like it." But Stephen would continue to shout at the Lord in a kind of impotent defiance.